When we talk about the Jim Crow era, we often talk about life in terms of how people experience that life during that era. But we often don't talk about what happened immediately after Jim Crow started coming down. Today, I want to share with you what it was like being a Generation X post Jim Crow individual growing up in the rural South, and why it's important that the stories that we learn from our generation, as well as the generation who experienced that, still matter today. I grew up in a small rural town in southeast Arkansas, Pine Bluff to be exact. My mom, who was the second of 6 kids, and she was the only girl. And my uncles and my mom, their age is from 1944, their birthdays from 1944 to 1955. They literally were growing up during the time when Jim Crow was not only at its height, but it was also when we were making the transition of Jim Crow being eradicated through the Civil Rights Movement. In 1954, you had Brown versus Board of Education, which resulted in the elimination of the separate but equal, especially in the education system. 2 of my uncles specifically, my Uncle Gary and my Uncle Ronnie, who were the 2 youngest, actually had the experience of going from a segregated school system to an integrated school system. And I can tell from talking to both of them, their experiences were not pleasant. As my Uncle Ronnie once told me, he said the moment that he transitioned from a segregated school to an integrated school, he found himself in fights all the time, being picked on by, quite frankly, white kids on a regular basis. The youngest uncle, my Uncle Gary, often shares the account that he said he got called the N-word so many times, jokingly, that he almost thought it was his name. So literally that meant that when all these crucial pieces of integration laws came through and civil rights laws came through, my family members were experiencing this in real time. And I can tell you it wasn't a pleasant experience. Persons who are considered a part of Generation X are those individuals who were born between 1965 and 1980. I can tell you, if as an older Generation X, because I was born in 69, growing up in the rural South as a African-American male provided a unique experience in terms of figuring out how to move in this brave new world that my parents had never experienced. My mom, as I indicated, was born in 46, so she grew up, for the most part, the majority of her almost all of her childhood life and a good portion of the early years of her adult life in a segregated society. So now as we transition, she had the responsibility of raising a child who now was going to have a lived experience in a culture and experience that she didn't have. One of the things that was interesting from not only experiencing with her as well as my uncles and so forth and family members was just being informed about being cautious about areas that you could and couldn't move in. And again, remember, as a Generation X, I grew up in a world that was integrated. I didn't know what a segregated world looked like. So even though I was starting to become uniquely aware that there were these hostilities, and of course I knew from the historical standpoint, experiencing those hostilities in this new environment was something that was very new for me. But the other part that was equally fascinating was appreciating and recognizing that I was now able to move into spaces that my loved ones previously couldn't move. Most of us are familiar with the sit-ins that participated at the various lunch counters, and Montgomery Ward was probably the most famous one, or infamous. We had a Montgomery Ward's in my hometown, and I can tell you, when I was a kid, I can remember going to Montgomery Ward's on Main Street in my hometown and being excited that I could eat at the lunch counter, but having no idea that my uncle, my mom's oldest brother, actually participated in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee at one of these counters and found himself having food poured on top of his head. It was completely unknown to me at that time, and I wouldn't find out until well into my adulthood that actually happened. And these were just one of many stories of establishments where as me and my generation, we could go into these establishments and enjoy engaging in them where our family members previously could not. One of the things that we don't talk about is the Klan didn't disappear. For those of you who are aware, the Ku Klux Klan was, for lack of better words, a terrorist organization. they actively utilized their abilities to both terrorize and enact hostilities against people of color for a variety of reasons, whether it be voting, whether it be boycotts, whatever the case may be. A lot of times when we talk about the transition from a segregated to integrated society and the coming down to Jim Crow, we don't talk about where was the Klan during this time period. And I can remember growing up in periods of time where I knew from talking to friends and family members that there were still cross-burning activities that they were doing. So imagine being of an age where you know this is their legacy. I was intimately aware with the legacy of violence of the Klan. So imagine that weird dichotomy as you're now growing up in this new integrated society, but there are still remnants of those individuals who want to make it very known to people of color that they are still a presence in our society. We often don't think about the fact that there were still elements of segregation and what segregation was like that was still present, even though we have now moved into an integrated society. For me, when I was growing up, I was informed by my mom that when she was coming up, there was 3 high schools in the immediate area. There's a few more in the outskirts, but there were 3 primary ones in my hometown. Pine Bluff High School, which provided services for the white kids, and Southeast High School and Merrill High School. Because in my hometown had the distinction of being one of the few towns in Arkansas that had a majority of African Americans. That they were the majority population. Up to a particular period of time, there was only 2 schools, Pine Bluff High School and Merrill High School. But of course, service members coming back, there was an explosion of childbirths during this time period. You now have a larger population of Black students who are matriculating. And as they're getting to high school age, the realization is they can no longer accommodate all those kids in one high school. So in the words of my mom, that was the fastest high school they ever thrown up, which was Southeast High School. By the time I entered the education system and we had become integrated, all the high school kids were going to Pine Bluff High School. Merrill High School had been destroyed, but Southeast High School had been converted to a middle school. So by the time I got there in the 7th grade, I was familiar with the fact, mainly because I had family members and family friends who let me know that the school that I was going to as a middle school used to be an all-Black high school. So this was a daily reminder of not only where we were, because now this high school this middle school is an integrated middle school as opposed to an all-Black high school, but it was also a reminder of what our society looked like back previously before I got there. Probably one of the biggest things that I can recall growing up during this time period, and especially as I headed into my adulthood and young adulthood, was learning how to travel in the South. I learned very quickly in almost every scenario that I was in, the importance of being mindful where you travel to. So when I was going to college, I was driving from Pine Bluff to Tampa, Florida, which required me to cut through parts of Louisiana, parts of Mississippi, parts of Alabama into Florida. And at the time, there were only a couple of interstate routes that connected me. One was in Florida and one was in Mississippi. So that meant the good majority of the trip that I had to take was back roads. And so I learned very quickly when I was traveling through various areas that I needed to be mindful of going through certain towns. But not only mindful in terms of potential speed traps, but I learned fairly quickly, especially from loved ones, about where I needed to be sensitive to areas that might be hostile to people of color. When you're Black and you have someone who is telling you to be careful, they're not talking about it from a speed trap context. They're talking to you about areas that are still hostile against people of color. Which brings me to another important point when it talks about traveling. You've got to keep in mind that between 87 and about 1998 and so forth during this time period, there was not an active use of social media or satellite radios or even cell phones. At this particular point, we're just starting to see the proliferation of cell phones, which meant that my generation, we traveled pretty much with no communication devices whatsoever. And another part of that was knowing where those particular towns were that literally still had that mentality that if you're Black, you better not be in their town when the sun goes down. And for those of you who are not familiar with those are referred to as sundown towns. So you learn very quickly the importance of knowing where those places where you could be safe. It's important to recognize that in the Black community, churches take on a greater significance because these were safe spaces. I'm talking about safe spaces, places where you can go, where you could be around people who could educate you on how to navigate. They could tell you where other safe spaces are. They could tell you where other safe people are. They can tell you where events and activities were that you were welcome. You could go to these places and figure out how to maneuver in areas very quickly. The reality is that there is a lot of people who, especially from my family and probably many others, who still bear the scars of the trauma of that transition. My uncle, even today, and he's still living, shares those stories about what it means to go through that brutality of integration. My mother still recalls what it's like when she got on a bus, not a school bus, but a regular bus, made the mistake of sitting in the front and the bus wouldn't move. I can still recall speaking to my aunt about how her mom refused to eat in an establishment because they never served Black people. And then when they finally did, she chose to not patronize because she was still traumatized from that. I think it's important for people to recognize that there is still a generation of people here who were still traumatized from that experience. And it does them a huge disservice and future generations a disservice by implying that once we provided these mechanisms to address these harms, that automatically corrected everything and changed hearts and minds overnight. That did not happen. And also appreciating that legacy is also appreciating the reality that there are also those shared traumatic experiences that can never be undone. If you are of a certain age and you were here when 9/11 occurred, everybody has a 9/11 story. Let me share with you another collectively traumatizing moment. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. Almost every adult that I've talked to has a story about where they were when they found out that he was assassinated. But even more so, what I found was that how people responded and how those communities addressed those responses was touched in every way, shape, or form. It didn't matter where you were at. So it didn't matter whether you're in a large city or not. That was a collective trauma based on the significance of Dr. Martin Luther King. And they all can tell you about where they were when it happened. To not appreciate that trauma and to, again, act as if, oh, it was just a great tragedy. No, it was more than just a great tragedy. There is still a generation of people who still live that trauma here today. But the other reason why I bring this up is not to try to rehash or make anybody feel bad. It's just also to acknowledge the fact that a lot of people who went through that trauma don't share the scars of that trauma. Again, I really don't think people really appreciate what it means to have to go through that environment. There is a segment of us, whether you be Generation X, whether it be Millennial, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, whatever the case may be, we never knew what that was like. We don't know that kind of world. But there was a world that was so different. And there were so many stories of trauma that those individuals went through that we can't even relate to today. So it's important that we recognize that there's a lot of people here who sit in silence and don't share with others about the trauma they experienced. If you're a Generation Xer or even younger, and you have family members who knew what it was like growing up in that area, if they were Black, white, or any other ethnicity, and they knew what it was like to grow up during that tumultuous era, don't let them leave this world and take those stories and traumas with them. Sit down with them. Ask them questions about it. I'm not telling you that you're trying to dredge up the past, but a lot of times we've allowed ourselves to fall into this trap of believing that history is only what people tell us and not what people have lived. There's a lot of lived history that may be around you if you have family members who went through that period of time. And it's important because they saw things and experienced things that you will never understand. And if you let them leave this world without sharing that information with you, you would have left a part of history, American history, our history, that you could learn something from and pass on to future generations.